David HaMelech was sitting in his palace anxiously awaiting news from the front. A most difficult front, because the enemy in this case was none other than his son Avshalom. On top of the tower stood David HaMelech's tzaifa, a kind of a guard or spy that would stand from a high vantage point, and he would let the king know if he saw anyone coming. By Yoiner HaTzaifa, the pasuk says, "Ani roya es merutzas harishon ki merutzas Achimaatz ben Tzadok." The first one who is running toward us, from the way he is running, I can tell it is Achimaatz ben Tzadok. By Yomer HaMelech, so the king said, "Ish toivze, he's a good person. Yotzaira toive yavai." Good people like to bring good news. Now, in reality, there was good news and there was bad news. The good news was that Avshalom was killed, so that David's enemies and the uprising had been put down. The bad news was, Saif Kol Saif, David's son, was killed. Achimaatz was not interested in giving the bad part of the news. He merely exclaimed to the king, "Vayomer, Baruch Hashem Elokecha, shesigar es hanashim asher nasu es yadam ba'adayni HaMelech." All those that attempted to overthrow the king have been locked, meaning have been taken prisoner. He specifically avoided relaying the news about the death of Avshalom. As a matter of fact, from the way he presented it, David HaMelech was almost misled to believe that Avshalom was alive. Vayomer HaMelech Shalom l'nar Avshalom, is my son alive? And Achimaatz went on again to stress about what a great victory it was and how the king now has peace and tranquility. But as far as the status of Avshalom himself, that Achimaatz said, "I don't know." The second messenger came with that news. When Yeshaya Hanavi says, the Rebbeinu Shalom can't wait to bring us the good news that it's all over, that Galus is history, that we are returning, an analogy is drawn to Achimaatz ben Tzadok, who couldn't wait to come and bring David HaMelech the good news. And the Medrash understands from this, it is a tzikta de Rav Kahana, Shekol HaMelamed Tzneguria al Yisrael, anyone who brings good news, who wants to bring good news about Klal Yisrael, who wants to say nice things about them. HaKadosh Baruch Hu meroinen by the olam. HaKadosh Baruch Hu lifts him up. And the Psikta makes the most interesting Kalvachayim. Madach Achimaatz ben Tzadok, who in reality wasn't bringing all that good news, because the fact is, he didn't know whether Avshalom was alive or not. But because of his attitude, because he wanted so much for the king to feel relieved, therefore he presented it, perhaps inadvertently presented the case in such a way that David HaMelech thought that his son was alive. And because of that, he becomes the symbol of whom HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to lift up and to raise. So Misha Melamed Tzneguria al Banav Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, one who comes and looks to find chusin on the sons of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In other words, someone who has an attitude in life, is always looking to try to find something nice to say about Klal Yisrael. Al achas kama v'kama. In what status does that put him? Teidalach shilkein. And I will prove it to you, says the Psikta de Rav Kahana. Shekol yomov shel Moshe. Throughout all the days of Moshe Rabbeinu, despite the tremendous praise that the Torah so often characterizes Moshe Rabbeinu with, however, this term, Ish Hu Elokim, we do not find Ad Shelimed Saniguria. Saniguria means one who teaches chusim and a defense for his people. Shenemer, as the pasuk says, V'zois habracha sheberach Moshe Ish Hu Elokim. This is the first time Moshe Rabbeinu is referred to as Ish Hu Elokim, and it is a result of a Zois habracha sheberach Moshe. It's a result of a pasha that begins with Moshe Rabbeinu's will to bench Klal Yisrael. The V'day Moshe from the Yershav Rebbetzin Levacha really asks, the term Saniguria means, as he said before, a defense. The Kateger is the prosecutor, the Senegar is the defense attorney. If anything, in Pashas Kisisa, Moshe was the great defender of Klal Yisrael. But over here, we don't see per se a defense of Klal Yisrael, we see a willingness to bench Klal Yisrael, to bless them. So indeed, he brings another girsa to the Medrash that says that Moshe Rabbeinu was not referred to as Ish Elokim Acha Bircha, until he blessed them, as opposed to Acha Limit Saniguria. But the Moshe explains it's really not a contradiction at all. Moshe Rabbeinu's blessing of Klal Yisrael was a testimony that they are Ra'ui L'Bracha, that they are indeed worthy of the blessing. The Bar Moshe explains that the Medrash does not suggest that Moshe Rabbeinu was not worthy of the title of Ish Elokim until the last day of his life. The Medrash merely means to imply that the pasuk never officially states that Moshe Rabbeinu was an Ish Elokim until we come to our parsha over here that begins with Zois habracha shederech Moshe Ish Elokim. Moshe's willingness to bench Klal Yisrael. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu's final communication with Klal Yisrael in the form of devoting himself entirely to their blessing, that is what triggered the pasuk over here to define Moshe as Ish Elokim. It can also be suggested perhaps that before a person's passing, his last act often defines his entire life, or the ratzon, the tshuka, his attitude, his mechus, the essence of his life. I know a story of a lady that was nifter several years ago, and she was taken to be buried on Har HaZeisim. And that was during the time that they had opened the tunnel underneath, and there were terrible riots going on, and it was mamish sakana. That day, the Chaver Kaddish had already attempted several levayos, and they were pelted with stones, and either they were turned back, or it had to be done in great haste. And when her aron was brought on Har HaZeisim, as if by cue, there was a ceasefire. There were no rocks, there were no stones, everything was peace and quiet. Her family was able to go out with her, everything was done properly with the greatest honor, and they had no problem returning to Yerushalayim. And as soon as they came back, the stones started flying again. And her husband then remembered a story that happened many, many years ago. It seems that in 1948, a relative of this woman passed away. And there was a curfew. You couldn't leave the actual settlement. And this woman, a young girl, went out and argued with the British that they allow the funeral procession to pass through for this relative of hers. And they told her, you're out of your mind, you're going to be killed. There are bombs falling all over the place. There's mortar fire all over the place. There are bazookas flying in the air. Go back. And she stood there and begged and cried, and everyone pleaded with her, and she said she's willing to risk her life for this person that was very special to her. Just don't stop her. And the British soldier was so overwhelmed by her pleas, so touched by her devotion, that he ordered an escort for her. And the levaya was done slowly and with great honor. And now suddenly, here you have it. By her own levaya, once again, HaKadosh Baruch Hu steps in and stops the fighting for her. In a person's passing of this world, things happen that sometimes point out, personify their essence, what they really wanted down here. We saw with the passing of Rabbi Shara Zechayim L'Vracha. The last deed that he did was bringing Klal Yisrael together, which is something that he worked on his entire life. And this is sort of a Kadosh Baruch Hu's testimony to a successful life, to a life of truly trying to serve Hashem. When Rav Shneur Zechayim L'Vracha passed away, so his aron was brought to the airport. And there's one point where the aron is loaded onto the plane, whether it's for security reasons or union reasons, that generally it's only the airport workers that lift the aron and place it into the actual cargo place of the plane. But over here, it was the Rosh Hashiva, it was the great Gadol of Klal Yisrael, the person who had exhibited so much love, and there was much pleading and much winding of red tape, and permission was given for the Bacharim to carry the aron directly onto the plane. At no point would he have to be carried by anyone else. And as he was put onto the plane and the Bacharim were leaving, they noticed there was another aron there of a Yiddish lady. So the Bacharim figured, look, we're here already, we can do an Hashama, a Taiva, why not? And they asked permission, look, we're already standing over here, can we place the other aron over there as well? And the permission was granted. So later on, someone pointed out that that woman must have had a tremendous chus. If she was accorded a certain honor that normally it's not done. Rav Sher Zechayim L'Vracha said, he thinks there's a different shot. This was the way Rav Shneur lived his life. Rav Shneur Zechayim L'Vracha always treated the simple person with unbelievable respect. This is something I can attest to with my own eyes, and anyone who had any shaykhus with him can. The Pasha to Yid got the same smile as the most chashuv person. The Pasha to Yid, Yidden, child, who met Rav Shneur, received an unbelievable warmth from him. And he would go to amazing difficulties in order to make sure that no one's honor should be slighted. It didn't make a difference who it was, how big or how small, how old or how young. So here he himself was zeichet to this chus, that the Vachim should carry him all the way. And it was as if he cried out to them, and you're going to embarrass this other neshama that's standing right behind me and treat it like an ordinary person? Carry your also. That's how he lived his life. So he was able to convey those instructions even from Gan Eden, even from the Olam HaEmes. And in a sense, that's what the pasuk is saying here. V'zayis habracha asher derech Moshe ish Elokim es b'nei Yisrael lifnei Mosai. Lifnei Mosai. Moshe Rabbeinu's last deed, his transition physically from this world into the world beyond, is personified by an act which represents the will of his entire life, what he endeavored, what he hoped for his entire life. Some people dream about winning lottery tickets. Some people dream about a nicer house, about security. Moshe Rabbeinu's dream was, how can I bench Klal Yisrael? The Zayis Habracha Sheberech Moshe Ishu Ekim Es B'nei Yisrael Lifnei Mosai. Moshe Rabbeinu's relationship to Klal Yisrael was bracha. How can I be mishpiyah to them? How can I give over to them? And that's how he left this world with. And that's why over here he is defined as Ishu Elokim. Now, it is not to suggest that he wasn't Ishu Elokim until then. It is to suggest that this is the Torah's testimony on the life of Moshe Rabbeinu. From the way he leaves the world, you can see who he was. The Skvedet Rebbe Zachayin Levracha, before he passed away, he was in Meshunadik Yisurim. Terrible, terrible pain. And he refused to take painkillers because he wanted to be alert until his last moments. And what did he do with this clarity of mind until his last moments? I heard from people that were there. Ve'edaf bracha. Who needs a blessing? Bring me names, he cried, in his Yisurim in pain, the last moments. So-and-so doesn't have children. May the Rebbeinu Shalom help him with Zerah Shel Kayama. What was that other person's name? So-and-so, his name. He needs a shidduch. Will the Rebbeinu Shalom help him? May all his children be zeicha to shidduchim. So-and-so needs a refuah. And that is how he left the world, begging and crying for names, pleading that with his last chutzim over here in this world, he should be able to leave a bracha for someone else. We mentioned this many times. The Chavetz Chaim once sent shluchim to a certain old man, a gazir, who didn't have any children. And they were going to ask him to leave at least some of his money for the yeshiva, so it should be his chutz for his neshama. And the person heard what they had to say, but he was reluctant to agree to anything. He said he would have to make a decision where he was going to leave his money. Ultimately, where did he leave his money to? There was a certain hospital in Poland that did research on how to heal sick dogs, and he left all of his money to that institution. Absolutely nothing for any of the yeshivas in Europe, absolutely nothing for any of the Hachnasas Archim organizations, for any Chevra Kadisha, for any Chesed organization. No Yid was going to benefit from what he did, and as a matter of fact, not even a human being was going to benefit from what he did. So the Shaluchim that had gone to him and tried to explain to him, what do you have to lose? It will be a chus for your neshama. They felt so despondent, such failures, and they came back to the Chavetz Chaim and they told him what happened, out of all places to leave his money. So the Chavetz Chaim said, you don't understand. A person has to be zeicha. The last couple of moments when a person makes decisions that's going to affect his neshama from here on in, he is guided. And he is guided on the basis of how he lived his life. Because he showed no appreciation to Torah throughout his lifetime, therefore, Min HaShamayim, they put this idea into his head. You know, a great place to leave money to is to a hospital for a sick dog. The Chavetz Chaim explained to the Shluchim, it's not your fault. That person was not Zaycha. If he didn't live his life that way, then Min HaShamayim, they weren't going to let him to leave his life that way. The Moshe Kotze Medrash in Kehelas Rabbah Perik Gimel Yud Ches. Kalaisa mitzvah samach lemisasai. Doima shloi haisa midas sitkasi chasera ki im oisa mitzvah v'hishlima. If someone leaves this world after performing a mitzvah, it appears to present a situation where this person had completed his life. He had completed his shlichus over here. And the only thing he was missing was just one more mitzvah, one more drop of icing on the cake. And with the hashlama of that mitzvah, his neshama now returns perfectly to Shammai. The respective brachas of both Yaakov Avinu and Moshe Rabbeinu was a hashlama to their life. And that's why Rashi says, "V'zayis habracha sheverach Moshe Yishu alikinu b'nei Yisrael lifnei Mosai." Rashi stresses samuch l'misasai. Well, if Yaakov and Moshe wanted to leave this world in the course of their last mitzvah, which would be their final touches on a lifetime effort, and in the case of Yaakov Avinu and Moshe Rabbeinu, their lifetime effort was to bench Klal Yisrael. It's interesting to note the Kedushas Levi says on the pasuk in Pashas Noach, "Ki oischa re'isi tzadik lefonai b'dar hazeh." We know that Noach is faulted for not having been Moshe Nevish himself for the sake of the people of his generation, to be mispower for them. Now the term tzaddik means righteousness. Moshe Rabbeinu is the epitome of the term tzaddik. Why? Because he spent his lifetime trying to be mavzik the actions of Klal Yisrael before HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Klal Yisrael means to be good. They want to be good. They are good. So the Rebbeinu Shalom, in praising Noach, also gave him a little bit of musar. You, on the basis of your own actions, may be a tzaddik. But to be a complete tzaddik in terms of your relationship with the people around you, for that, we're going to have to wait. We're going to have to wait for Bidar Hazeh. Bidar Hazeh refers to the Dar of Moshe Rabbeinu. As the pasuk says, Zeh Moshe, Ki Zeh Moshe Ha'ish. It is only then, when you're in a Neshama in Noach, which will be Kalo in the Neshama of Moshe Rabbeinu, and indeed in the Midrashim and in the Zohar, there's an allusion to the relationship between the Neshama of Noach and that of Moshe Rabbeinu. Then you will be Misakein, the true term Tzaddik. Because then Tzaddik will not define your own actions in life, but Tzaddik will define your Limud Chus and Klal Yisrael. You're always having a nice thing to say about Klal Yisrael. Probably one of the most basic rules in grammar is that a sentence does not begin with and. The word and, A-N-D, is always in the middle of a sentence. It combines two things. How can you begin a sentence with and? You're starting a new sentence. What are you connecting it with? You definitely don't begin a paragraph with and you definitely don't begin a whole new chapter with and. What's interesting, though, is that lahavdol in Lashon Kodesh, we seem to find exactly the opposite. For example, every Masechta begins Daf Beis, not Daf Aleph. Why? The Vel says a var to show that as much as you've learned, you always have to remember you have never really begun. Often, even brand new parshiyos begin with a vav, and we know that a vav at the beginning of a word is the equivalent to and. Vav Moisiv al Inyan Rishon. Vav is a vav hachibur. The truth is, the Torah de Hashkaf is that nothing is really brand new. Ein chadash tachas hashemesh. Everything in life is part of a sequence. Life itself is a script from day number one until the last day. And each thing flows into something else. Novel experiences, brand new experiences, new challenges in life, the ups and the downs, they're not really new. It was all part of the master plan. Another noikivitz boy mumata, a person doesn't bump his finger down here in this world. Everything is predestined. Our responses to the changing situations in life depend on our previous responses. Mitzvah gereris mitzvah. The more betachin, the more emunah, the more mysterious nevish we apply to any particular incident in life, gears up our batteries for even more betachin for the next challenge. And Rahman Allah, the opposite is true as well. So everything in life is connected. The last parsha in the Torah begins, Ze Zois Habracha. And this is the bracha, this is the blessing, Asher Beirach Moshe, Ishu Elokim Es Bnei Yisrael, Lifnei Moshe. We've already discussed the Medrash. The Moshe Rabbeinu was never referred to as Ish Elokim. Despite all of his greatnesses, despite all of his accomplishments, his Mesiras Nefesh for Klal Yisrael, the splitting of the Yam Suf, the bringing down of the Torah, everything that happened until now did not warrant the title Ishu Elokim until Asher Beirach Moshe. What was
the icing on the cake? What would be the jewel in the crown of Moshe Rabbeinu's life? That he was zeicha to the epitome of bracha, the zeisa bracha sheberach Moshe, and once he was committed with all of his essence, these last moments of his stay on this world, to bench Klal Yisrael, to give over that bracha, he is referred to as Ishu Elikim. However, why does the pasuk begin v'zais and this? And is a chibur, and connects. What is this connected to? Zok the Arachaim HaKadosh, let's take a closer look at the last psukim in Parshas Hazinu. The last psukim in Parshas Hazinu are difficult psukim for Moshe Rabbeinu. The Yedaber Hashem Moshe b'yetzem hayom ez aleimar. The yetzem hayom is in the middle of the day, whether Klal Yisrael likes it or not, there's nothing they can do to stop it. There are 3 times in the Torah it says b'yetzem hayom hazeh. When Noach went into the Teva, because the people of his generation said, if we're going to see Noach try to save himself, we're not going to let him. We'll just bring axes and smash the Teva. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu said he's going to come in the middle of the day and we'll see if you can stop it. When the Yidden left Mitzrayim, it says, B'yetzem hayom hazeh hoitzi Hashem, because the Mitzrayim also said, as soon as we feel that they're leaving, we'll never allow it. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, yes, you can make all the plans in the world, you can bring all of the artillery and weapons, I'm going to take them out of Mitzrayim, smack in the middle of the day. And anyone who can come and stop it, let him try. And now the third time when it comes to the niece of Moshe Rabbeinu, Klal Yisrael said, what? If we feel Moshe Rabbeinu is going to leave us, the person who took us out of Mitzrayim, who split the Yam for us, who brought down the Mun for us, who made the Slav accessible to us, who gave us the Be'er Shel Miriam, who gave us the Torah, we're not going to allow it. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, it's going to happen in the middle of the day, and there's nothing you can do about it. HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Moshe Rabbeinu, go up on the mountain, you will see Eretz Yisrael, but you will not enter Eretz Yisrael, for you will pass away on that mountain, just like Aaron your brother did. Yes, a special kind of passing from this world, called Misas Neshika, but nonetheless, Moshe would not be zeichet to go into Eretz Yisrael. And why? As a punishment. Because of the name Meriva. Klal Yisrael gave you a hard time by the name Meriva. They challenged you, you lost your patience with them. They challenged you to hit the rock instead of talking to the rock. You tried to convince them that opportunity for Kiddush Hashem was not exercised, you didn't follow my instructions, and therefore you're not going to go into Eretz Yisrael. Therefore, Ki Mineget Tiras Haaretz, only from far are you going to see the land. And you have to do it now, because no time is left. And you will not arrive over there, at least not now. You will not be zeicha to be from those who will enter Eretz Yisrael. What a sad way to end Moshe Rabbeinu's career of outright Mesiras Nefesh for Klal Yisrael. Sad, but necessary, the Mefarshim explain. Moshe Rabbeinu would remain with Klal Yisrael, sort of remaining with Klal Yisrael in Galus in order to be their chizuk in Galus, in order to prepare the way and make sure no Yid gets lost in Galus. But after all is said and done, L'maisa, Moshe would not go into Eretz Yisrael. And then at the end of Parshas Hazinu, and now we have a new Parsha. And connected to the previous Parsha, and this is the bracha that Moshe Rabbeinu bench Klal Yisrael. And Moshe Rabbeinu is going to give the greatest brachas of all time. The very blessing that is the source of our existence, that is Mamshech the Yeshua Hashchina within us, that is the reason we are still here learning Torah. What's the connection, in fact, the Arachaim HaKadosh? We go from the saddest of sad to the holiest of holy, to the happiest of the term happiness. And the Torah connects it. The Torah says this is the natural sequence of events. One thing has to follow the other. Zakti Arachaim HaKadosh, this is the lesson. Human nature is such, if one person causes another harm, you don't like that person. If one person causes another such harm that that person loses his position, obviously you have even a greater sense of ill feeling toward him. If one person causes another person such harm that the man loses his position, or maybe even Chas v'Shalom loses his whole life, obviously there can't be a greater sense of anger or animosity that the victim is going to feel for the aggressor, whether he intended to do so or not. And if the victim, by nature of his relationship to the person who caused his downfall, spent his entire life helping that person, exercised ultimate Mesiras Nefesh to keep that person alive, and at the end the thank you that he got was being dragged into a situation where he lost everything, the sense of foreboding, the sense of stay away from me, I don't want to have anything to do with you, would be overwhelming, it would be enormous. Okay, so you have a tzaddik. A tzaddik is a savlin. A tzaddik can rise to the madrega where one person could cause all of this difficulty for him and he still does not hate him. But does he love him? Is there a kurvas halev? Is there true closeness of hearts? One would think it would be virtually impossible. Put together the end of Parshas Azinu and the beginning of the Zayis HaBracha. This is the Parsha of Bracha. What Yaakov Avinu did for his children, Moshe Rabbeinu did for Klal Yisrael. He completely emptied out his whole heart, his very essence, into Klal Yisrael these last couple of moments. And when did he do this? Right after he was informed, you have lost everything and you will not go into Eretz Yisrael because Klal Yisrael dragged you into the Chetnei Merizah. His response to that was, now I will bench them. Now I will exhibit the greatest love toward them. Now I will show that I harbor no ill feelings. Now sometimes time heals wounds. One person hurts another person. That person suffers during his time of suffering. Of course there is anger. There is frustration. But time goes by, his suffering is over. He comes to terms with reality, and there can even be reconciliation. But the Torah Kedusha tells us more over here, says the Orach Chaim HaKadosh. The Zayis HaBracha and the normal sequence of hatred that normally fills the void, that normally takes effect when one person destroys another. That didn't take place over here. The and Zayis HaBracha. Just the opposite. Moshe will show his greatest love right now to Klal Yisrael after he was informed that he wasn't going into Eretz Yisrael. And Asher Beirach Moshe Ishu Elokim Es Bnei Yisrael, and the pasuk emphasizes Lifnei Moshe. And this wasn't shot as well. So much time elapsed since the troubles that he was willing to forgive and forget. It was Lifnei Moshe. It was right now. Now he was going to feel the frustration of not going into Eretz Yisrael during the time of pain. This is when he was going to bench Klal Yisrael with the ultimate bracha. And that's why it is dafka over here in this pasuk that Moshe Rabbeinu is referred to as Ishu Elokim. Beyond any shaychus to human beings, to natural human behavior, or even supernatural human behavior. I heard a Maisa that somebody once gave the Chazaynish a ride under difficult circumstances. And the Chazaynish took him by his hands and he gave him a long, long bracha. And it gave him a bracha for Arichas Yom, and this Yitzhak lived till his middle 90s. What does that mean? I once heard from an Adam Gadol who repeated this story. If you didn't give the Chazaynish a ride, he wouldn't give you the bracha? And the answer is no. If someone does me a favor, I have a sense of appreciation, a sense of a curse. I try to want to do him a favor back. If you do a favor to a tzaddik, the tzaddik wants to impart his blessing, his bracha. He uses that sense of simcha, that extra sense of kedusha that he feels, and he totally imparts it upon the person that should manifest itself in the greatest of blessings. He told me that when the Chavetz Chaim was very old, there was a minyan in the morning in Radin, and they allowed a select few in just for the minyan. That was the only time you were able to see the Chavetz Chaim. And the Chavetz Chaim's gartel fell down. The Chavetz Chaim wore a gartel the last years of his life. And this young bacher ran over, and he picked up the gartel and he wrapped it around the Chavetz Chaim. And the Chavetz Chaim gave him a warm glet, a nice little smile, touched him on his cheeks, and he said, you should have a long life, a good, safe life. This year told me that he went through one of the most difficult concentration camps. Afterwards, he was subject to one of the most horrendous, horrific death marches. His feet were sick. He had the courage to survive where so many others didn't. And he kept telling people, I know I'm going to survive. And they said to him, how do you know? And he said, because the Chofetz Chaim told me I'm going to live long. I did him the favor. I put the gartel around him. These are examples of the Kiddush of Tzaddikim. How in turn a little bit of joy, a little bit of simcha, in the most trivial way, that you are zeicha to do for a tzaddik, the tzaddik turns around and says, now let me take advantage of this and bless him from my full heart. Here the pasuk is saying about Moshe Rabbeinu, Ishu Elikim, that he was able to take frustration and pain that they caused him, and he turned around and gave them the greatest bracha and greatest blessing forever. That is the chiddush of the Orach Chaim HaKadosh of Zeis HaBracha. It's not a brand new parsha, not in Moshe Rabbeinu's life. It wasn't that he turned a new leaf and said, okay, I'll forgive you, let me bench you anyway. Somehow, this was the natural sequence of events. Then there's a second step that the Orach Chaim HaKadosh stresses in Zeis HaBracha. Moshe Rabbeinu didn't want in any way that his bracha should interfere. There should be any friction with his bracha and the brachas of the Avos. And therefore, this Zeis HaBracha, Moshe Rabbeinu took into account of the Orach Chaim HaKadosh the bracha that Avram benched Yitzchak, that Yitzchak benched Yaakov, that Yaakov benched his children with. And he wanted to make it clear that this is in addition to those brachas. This is a toisus on those brachas. I want to reiterate the original brachas that you already have and add to it. So according to the second Shana, the Orach Chaim HaKadosh, the Zeis HaBracha connects Parshas Zeis HaBracha to Parshas Vayechi. The way the Ber Moshe and the Yerush Rebbe Chaim HaBracha explains it, Yaakov Avinu originally understood. He laid down the blueprint of the brachas, and Moshe Rabbeinu would carry those brachas to fruition. And he says that's why the Lashon is the Zeis HaBracha Sheberach Moshe Ishu Lekim as Bnei Yisrael, as opposed to Am Yisrael or Shiftei Yisrael, because the same bracha that Yaakov Avinu gave to his children, this bracha was now put into place through Moshe Rabbeinu. The Ber Moshe, however, has a little bit of a different explanation to the Vav here in the Zeis HaBracha. Klal Yisrael had been listening to a very difficult drasha here from Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu would end with the brachas, with the ultimate blessings, but the beginning of the drasha was a difficult pill to swallow. It had the Taisach in Parshas Kisavai. Parshas Nitzavim had its shares of warnings. And even in Parshas Havinu, Vayomer Astira Panim Mehem Erem Achrisam, the Torah warns of difficult times. Klal Yisrael listened to difficult words. Ki eish katcha bi'ati v'tika dat shel tachtis v'taychel eretz v'yevulu v'talahid moizdei harim. Golus was not going to be easy. Mechutz t'shakol cherev v'mechadorim eima. The armies are marching with their sword outside. When the person runs into his house, he is so frightened that his own heart gives him no peace and destroys him. How many times did Klal Yisrael unfortunately live out these experiences in our pages of Galus, in the history of the years? Klal Yisrael listened to this, and they were told by Moshe Rabbeinu that it could happen, that it's going to happen. And now finally the difficult part of the drasha is over, and Moshe Rabbeinu gets to the last thing, and that is the bracha. The Vav over here in the Zeis HaBracha explains the Ber Moshe from the years of Rebbe Chaim HaBracha, straightens out a very important misconception. You would think, okay, there's going to be sorrows and trouble, and then comes the bracha. The and then comes the bracha is more than that. This Zeis HaBracha. Ultimately, Moshe Rabbeinu promises Klal Yisrael, when the time of bracha comes, then you're going to look back at your sufferings of the past, and you're going to understand that they were also blessings. Were blessings in disguise, and that veil could have been very thick. But you could have not been zeicha to this bracha unless you had to first face those challenges. During the time of Nisayan, let no one fool you. It is going to be difficult. It is going to be frightening. But ultimately, every yid comes to a point of bracha. Not only to a point of bracha where you can say, okay, let me forget the past and now begins the bracha, but this Zeis HaBracha. You will come to the point where, and you will now realize that all of these experiences was bracha. Because if not for those, you could have not reached the pinnacle, the plateau that is going to last forever after. And perhaps that is why there's a connection between Simchas Torah and the V'zayis habracha that we read multiple times, to emphasize that ultimately the time will come when we will understand that each of these stepping stones that were so difficult are actually the very formula that is going to create the real Simcha. The Kli Yakar was known throughout all of his drashas to stress the union of Hasmada. He himself was a tremendous masmid. And once he expounded on the Gemara Chagiga that says you cannot compare someone who chazers something only 100 times as opposed to someone who chazers over his learning 101 times. After the drasha, someone came over and said, in all due respect, Rabbi, I don't understand. Between 100 and 101, what's the difference? And why did the Gemara pick these numbers, 101 times of chazar as opposed to 100 times? So the Kli Yakar had an answer for him right there and then. He said, how do you say remember in Lashon Kodesh? Zachar. Figure out the gematria of the word Zachar. It's 227. Zayin is 7, Chaf is 20, Resh is 200. Now how do you say forget in Lashon HaKodesh? Shechayach. Shechayach is 328. Shin is 300, Chaf is 20, Ches is 8. So 328 minus 227 is 101. So what is the difference between remembering and forgetting? The difference is whether or not you chazered 101 times. And that's where the Gemara in the Masechtas Chagiga says you cannot compare someone who only chazered it 100 times to someone who chazered it 101 times. We're going to be reading in Parshas V'zayis habracha, this Simchas Torah, the pasuk that is the basis of chinuch. It's the first word that a child is supposed to speak when he learns to talk. Torah tziva lanu Moshe Moirasha Kehilas Yaakov. The Chidah says in the Sefer Dvash Levi that the word tziva is gematria 101. Tzadik is 90, Vav is 6, Hey is 5. Torah tziva lanu Moshe. Moshe commanded us to chazer the Torah until we know it, meaning we have to chazer whatever we learn 101 times. The Baal Shem Tov said, the 1 in 101 refers to the Echad, meaning Ein Adaima, you cannot compare someone who simply chazers something 100 times to someone who chazers something 100 times and is thinking about the Rebbeinu Shalom. He's learning Torah because the Rebbeinu Shalom told him to learn Torah. He is learning Torah because Limud HaTorah is the closest way a Yid comes to the Rebbeinu Shalom, as opposed to someone who is learning because he wants to have a good name. Or, worse than that, someone who is learning because he wants to say that he knows more than the next person. Others explain that the 101 in 100 means to say that even after he has it 100 times, he's not finished and he wants to go further. That shows that he's learning L'Shem Shemayim. If you're learning for a degree, let's say, and you feel you have to review it X amount of times in order to get a good mark on a test and get your diploma, so at the point that you're finished reviewing it, that amount of time, you say you don't want to see this anymore. You've reached your goal. So if a doctor says he has to read a certain book in order to pass a test, or an accountant says he has to read a certain book in order to get his CPA, and he feels that he has to read this 100 times in order to be able to get a decent mark on his test. So he's counting down. 98 more times to go. Oy vey. Every time he finishes, he looks forward to the fact that he has now one less to go. It's sort of the point of diminishing returns. Someone has a pile of old furniture in front of his house and he has to get it away, or else he can't leave. So with every piece of furniture that he moves away, he says, oh, one less. I can't wait till it's no longer here. But if I told you, you just won a raffle, you can walk into Tiffany's and you can take 100 items and it's yours. So he doesn't say, I already took 66. Shoo, only 44 left to go. Adirabba, just the opposite. Each one entices him more. Each one gets him more excited. And when it gets to number 100, he's very sad that it's over, that he has to leave now. Learning 100 times means someone decided, okay, I have to chazer this 100 times. If he stops after 100, that's a way of saying that for whatever motive he had, he learned it 100 times and he's happy that it's over with, that he's finished. On the other hand, learning it 101 times shows even after he chazered it 100 times, he says, but it can't be over. Can't be, I'm not going to go back to this. This joy cannot be in the past. I want it to be current. Let me do it one more time. So it's not just one person learned it 100 times and the other person learned it 101 times. One person schlepped broken furniture away from his door, 100 pieces, and the other person went and gathered 100 diamonds. We've mentioned many times. The father of habracha told me that Chaim Volozhiner once said that if a certain Talmud is going to chazer over this sugya 17 times, he'll take him for a personal chavrusa. So the next day, one Talmud came and said, Rebbe, I did it. And Chaim Volozhiner asked him, how many times did you learn it? He said, 17 times. He said, I'm not taking you. But the Rebbe promised. He said, look, if you would have learned it 18 times or 19 times, that is a simon that you learned it the first 17 times with the right idea. But if you stopped after 17 and said, shoo, I'm finished, that's not what I meant when I said 17 times. That's not the kind of limit that I was referring to. Thus, the Gemara tells us in the schacter Sukkah, we mentioned earlier, Kot na yedeya ledaber of his malam de Torah. And mahi, what are the first words that the father teaches him? Amar Rafanuna, Torah tziva lanu Moshe meirasha ke'elas Yaakov. Torah tziva lanu. Tziva is Gemashti 101. It's not what he's learning, it's the attitude that he's learning with. That's the yesod of chinuch. Now, there is much in the Mefarshim to try to explain why the Lashon is Torah tziva lanu Moshe meirasha ke'elas Yaakov as opposed to Yerusha, which would be the standard term for an inheritance. How do we explain the difference? What is the emphasis over here of meirasha as opposed to Yerusha? Here's how Rabbi Shua Leib Diskin Zochen Levach explained it. When an inheritance is transferred over to the next generation as a Yerusha is like a blank check. It's a key to the vault. It's yours. You can do whatever you want with it. No restrictions whatsoever. You're not accountable for it. You don't have to report to anyone. It's all yours. Meirasha, says Rabbi Shua Leib, indicates that indeed a certain individual is given control of an estate, but he's more like a trustee or an executor of an estate. In other words, we're giving you control of the money, maybe even more than an executor, maybe technically it's yours, but there are restrictions. It's conditional based on what you're going to do with the money, and somehow you have to report to some entity to confirm you're cooperating with the terms of how this money was transferred to you. The letter mem, when it's not part of the root of the word, when it's not part of the shoyrish of the word, means from. Bayis is house. Meha bayis means from the house. So, for example, take the word loiva, lamed vav hey. The loiva is the one who borrows money. The malva, when you add a mem to the beginning of the word, it means the one who lends money from him to someone else. A shliach is an agent. Mishaleach is the one who sends the agent. So Yerusha means it's all his. The inheritance is mine. Meirasha means someone is transferring it to you, but there's some connection to the one who's giving it to you. In a sense, you're like an agent from the person that you're receiving the inheritance from to carry out with this money what he wanted you to carry out the money with. Or at least you have to adhere to certain restrictions. Can't do whatever you want with it. It's interesting. He points out that in the entire Torah, the term Meirasha is only applied to two things. One is Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael belongs to us, but it's conditional, that we adhere to a certain standard in Eretz Yisrael. And the Torah. Torah, Tziva Lanu Moshe, Meirasha Ke'elas Yaakov, our pasuk. Dr. Yeshua Diskin. You have a country, the king passes away. Even if it's the king's son who takes over. But it's a whole different world. It could be that all of the prisoners are released. The king's son wants to assert power. So he bedafka dismisses his father's ministers. It's a different world. So the king inherited a malchus. He takes the malchus from his father, but it's a Yerusha. He does whatever he wants with it. That's not the Torah. The Torah is transmitted from generation to generation. There are Gedolei Torah in each generation, but no one can change anything. We are all committed to how Moshe Rabbeinu gave us the Torah. The Torah is a Yerusha for us, yes, in one way. On the other hand, it is a Meirasha. We're trustees and executors. We may have a tremendous amount of control, but we are still limited to the rules of the one who set up the trust, or the one who set up the estate. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave it to Moshe. Moshe wrote it down, and Moshe gave us the framework of how we are to carry out the Torah in our generation. It doesn't make a difference how the generation views things. It can be whether it's a 1700 captain of a ship looking through his looking glass, or it's the generation of the Hubble telescope. We see things the same way, the way Moshe Rabbeinu gave us the Torah, and we apply it to our particular set of circumstances. That's why it's Moirosha, not Yerusha. And that's what the pasuk says right afterwards, Vahibishu and Melech, Nisasiv, Rosh Yam, Yachad, Shiftei Yisrael. There are three ways someone becomes the ruler of a country. There's Vahibishu and Melech. He's the king. His father was the king. His grandfather was the king. It's automatic. The people don't have any say in the matter whatsoever. Then you have a kind of republic, where officially there is a leader of the country. He was not democratically elected by the people, but he doesn't have ultimate rule. There's a cabinet around him, or a party around him, some type of a congress. He's the head of them, but he's restricted by them. He has to answer to them. Basically, he's the head of the committee. So that is Behisasef Rosh Hayam. Then you have, sometimes, an individual who is elected by the people for the people. Democratically elected. He is in control. That is the third kind of ruler. And for that the pasuk says, Yachat Shiftei Yisrael. A king runs a country one way. His son, the different king, may run a country a different way. Parties with a particular political objective run a country one way, and then in democracy anything can happen. But there are definitely going to be changes from one leader to the next. So Dr. Yeshua, this is the message of the pasuk. Torah Tzivulanu Moshe, it is Moirosha Kehilas Yaakov. Torah Moshe is transmitted from generation to generation. And it doesn't make a difference whether it's Vahibishu and Melech, whether it's Besasev Rosh Hayam, whether it's Yachad Shiftei Yisrael. The regular forces of change, the regular mechanics of how leadership is created and transferred are totally irrelevant to us. Those change from power to power, and for us it's the same Torah Tzivulanu Moshe, which is a Moirosha for Kehilas Yaakov throughout the ages. Rav Moshe Chaim Levracha once said, imagine, a Kala goes out to buy her Shabbos Leichter, one of the most happy occasions in life. And the first time she lights those Shabbos Leichter, it's even a happier occasion. But how can you compare that to a mother who calls in her daughter and says, here, we just found these. And she unveils a beautiful set of Leichter, and she says, this was hidden by your great-grandmother during the war. It now comes to you as a Yerusha. And she tells her about the life of her grandmother. And the Kala takes these Leichter with trembling hands, and the mother tells her, it's yours, my daughter. You carry on now. Imagine what she feels like the first time she lights these Leichter. It's a different kind of joy. And that is the kind of love that should rise to the surface when you open up a Gemara explained of Moshe. It's Torah Tzivulanu Moshe, but not just something that we received, it is Moirosha Kehilas Yaakov. Your grandparents risked their lives, gave their lives for this. It's your Yerusha. The Avnei Nezer was one of the greatest Goinim in his time. The Kratzka said, you know why his father was Zeicha to have the Avnei Nezer? That once in his town, his father went into the Beis HaMedrash, Purim, and he sat down to learn. Just opened up a Gemara and really got involved, and he really felt the Simcha Satorah for a couple of moments. And it just so happened that during those couple of moments, there was no one else learning. And therefore he was Zeicha to bring down such a big neshama. Imagine the Simcha in Shemayim, when the Avnei Nezer said a shir, or he learned that piece of Gemara that his father learned, which opened up the Shari Shemayim for his neshama to come down to this world. I think what Rav Moshe is saying is that when you open up a sefer, think about this for a moment. Somewhere along the line, the chances are that your grandfather learned this same piece of Gemara, and who knows under what circumstances. And the malachim that were created then are Yerusha to you. The koiches of bracha, the special sha'orim and shemayim that open up pertain to you because he was your grandfather. The Torah is a Yerusha. Years ago, we had a young couple in our home. And the young Bible, a Balas Tshuva, a Tyra person was telling us her story. Her grandmother was a die-hard communist. The proverbial person who thanked God every single day that he's an atheist. A person who wanted to be buried in red. Communism was her religion. Communism was her hope. It would be the salvation of mankind. And naturally, along with her adopting the religion of communism, other religions had to be pushed out the window, including that of her mother's, grandmother's, great-grandmother's, and so on. This Anikel grew up over here, and even though she didn't grow up in a neighborhood with other from people, but like Rabbi Yaakov said, in these kinds of situations, there must have been some Baba someplace that shed the right tear at the right time by Lechzin, maybe by her Shabbos table, maybe hiding in a bunker, who knows. But this Anikel, this little girl, was drawn to other Erlicha people. And she was, you can't say retaught her heritage, because she was never taught, and she was attracted by it. And once she came home, and she decided, emphatically, that she's going to tzin lecht, because there had not been Shabbos lecht in her house for who knows how many generations. Her grandmother, who was raising her, said, absolutely not. And when the young girl made it clear that she was going to do it, whether her grandmother wanted or not, and if she couldn't do it at his house, she would move away someplace else, so the grandmother said, fine. But you know what? If you're going to do it, at least do it with these. I don't want you taking gifts from anyone. So the grandmother climbed up on a step stool and pulled out from the back of some forgotten closet 2 huge brass leichter. What is this? I've never seen this, grandmother. My mother used to use these, she said. It's much safer for fire. Not that I have any sentimental feelings, the grandmother argued, or at least tried to convince her granddaughter and herself. But these are safer. They won't topple over. If you're going to thin lecht, use these. So excitedly, she went to grab her lecht. And as she was about to put the lecht in, she noticed that there was still some wax left over from the melted candles the last time these leichter were used, which could have been about 70 years ago. So like your mother told you, that if you're not going to clean it up, no malach is going to come and clean it up. It's going to stay there forever. No one ever took the wax away. These leichter may have been smuggled out of Russia across an ocean. There may have been another generation that was blackmailed into spitting at it instead of lighting it. But the wax was still there. And this young woman described to me her emotions when she took her live candles and lit them, placed them, and she watched the wax of her Shabbos candles melt into the wax of her great-grandmother's candles, who lit these Neirois 70 years ago, hoping against hope that her children should remain Maminan in the Rabbeinu Shalom. I felt my great-grandmother's hand along mine as I lit it, as if our neshamis were joined. There was no question about it. She was standing next to me. I'm surprised that my tears didn't extinguish the lights. My tears? Was my grandmother trying to hide one of her own as she saw the candles flicker and quickly turned away? I think she was. A Yerusha is something, whether you like it or not, is transferred to you. Imagine, says the Dubna Maggid, the person has a menorah, and he is prepared to sit the entire night and learn by this menorah. There is enough oil to go the entire night. Unfortunately, as he sits down and makes himself comfortable, he reaches for his coffee and inadvertently topples over the menorah, and there it goes. The oil spills on the floor, and he now has to endure a night of darkness. Not a pleasant situation. He may be rather angry at himself for being so clumsy. He lost a whole night full of oil. However, says the Dubna Maggid, that isn't half as bad as the following scenario. Suppose a person purchased this special oil. He was told this is very special oil. You're going to see why. Pours it into his menorah and he sits down to learn. And he indeed learns the entire night by the oil of this menorah. But he wonders what's so special about it. And he looks at it in the morning. And he says, you know, not a drop of this oil used up. This is amazing. This is beyond belief. Wow. This oil is worth millions. What can be worth more than something that simply doesn't get consumed and you can keep using it? And he is so excited that he starts jumping up and down, and the menorah topples over and it spills out. And there's no way for him to lift the oil out of the floor. It seeped right into the sand floor, and he cannot purchase it again. This person begins to cry and scream. A fool who is standing next to him is going to say, I don't understand you.
You are much luckier than the first person. The first person knocked over the menorah at the beginning of the night. He had to endure a night of darkness. You were able to learn the entire night. However, a chacham will understand why the second person has more reason to cry than the first. True, the first person lost the value of oil for an entire night, and he had to sit in the dark the entire night. Hopefully he was able to learn about that. But the second person, true, he made it through the night, and indeed he had a delightful night, full of full of lechtigkeit. But he realizes in the morning what a precious commodity he has, unmatched, cannot be replaced, and he loses that. He lost something which is irreplaceable. The tragedy in the second story is far greater than that of the first person who knocked over the ordinary oil at the beginning of the night. The pasuk says, "U'Moshe b'nei v'esrim shana b'maaseh." Moshe Rabbeinu was 120 years old when he left this world. However, do you want to know what the tragedy was? Do you want to understand the loss? Then you have to realize that lechahasa einai, his eyes were not dim, v'leinas leichai. Neither of his natural forces abated. His skin had the same moisture that he had in his youth. Moshe Rabbeinu showed absolutely no outside sign of aging. So the Maggid, the Torah, wants to emphasize what this meant that Moshe Rabbeinu was taken from Klal Yisrael. It's not that you just lost oil that could be replaced. You lost the kind of oil that if you would have had it, if it wasn't taken from you, it never gets consumed, it never gets used up. Rashi says in the pasuk, "Lechahasa einai," so Rashi, "Af meshames," even after Moshe Rabbeinu passed away, his body did not decay. It remained youthful and fresh as it was till the last day of his life. There have been countless instances throughout the generations of where, for one reason or another, the kever of a tzaddik had to be opened. And people have seen this, that the tzaddik's body was completely whole, even after many years. La'achar hakvura. When the Stephaneshter Rebbe was moved to Eretz Yisrael, his body was completely whole. In Eretz Yisrael there is no aron, and the Chazon Ish ordered, Al Kiddush Hashem, they should make a levaya through Yerushalayim. Let everyone see this b'chosh. The Gra was moved, the Vilna Gaon was moved in the 1950s, his body was completely whole. There was a Yid in Skver who used to always tell over the story. During the war he was forced from one ghetto to the other, and he wound up in Lezhensk. And the Nazis noticed that Yidden were running over to the oil of the Rebbe Melech, and they were mispal over there. Ah, a place of hope for Jews. Anything that represents that they have a future, that gives them chizuk. To the Nazis, that was equivalent to the enemy's most powerful military base. That was priority number one. That had to be destroyed. Throughout the years, the Tzion of the Rebbe Melech was a place where Yidden came to be mispalel. To this very day it is that Rebbe Melech promised anyone who davens by his Tzion will not leave this world without tshuva. Now, the Nazis were not going to leave this, they thought. They picked up their rifles and ordered that anyone who doesn't engage in destroying this Tzion, who doesn't dig up the body, is going to be shot on the spot. Their highs, the Yidden picked up the shovels in their trembling hands, and they dug open the kever of the Rebbe Melech. It was no secret that the Rebbe Melech had passed away about 150 years prior to that, when they opened up the kever to the eyes of all those who opened it, as well as the Rishonim who were standing around, as well as the Nazis. It was clear as clear can be. His body was fresh and whole. Like kahasa einai, v'leinas leichai. The Nazis were so frightened, they quickly ordered the Jews, cover it quickly. And everybody, including the Nazi guards, ran off in all different directions in fright. Rebbe Melech Tzion was never touched. It stands there to this very day. This Yid who told over the story, he was one of the people that dug open the kever. He went on to survive the war. And he was nifter on Chav Aleph Adar, which is the yard site of the Rebbe Melech. There is something here really which ought to be clarified. We know that the minig is when a person is buried, the bottom of the orain is removed. The person ought to be buried into the ground. The quicker the guf decays, the greater the tikkun for the neshama. Preferably, if possible, we try to bury a person even before sundown. In Eretz Yisrael, no aron is used at all for this reason. So if there is such an inyan, that the person li'achamevi and mashana should be buried into the ground, and the quicker the guf decays, then the faster the neshama comes to its tikkun and to its ultimate menucha and resting place, and enjoys the light of Olam Haba. So why is this a maila that lechahasa eina zakrashi af mishames? Why is this a maila that so many tzaddikim are found whole even after hundreds of years? The Gemara tells us about Rabbi Elazar ben Shimon that he even tested himself during his life. He had a piece of flesh cut out, and he showed that it didn't decay in the sun. And indeed, after he passed away, he remained in his attic for many, many years, as the Gemara Masechus Bava Metzia explains, and absolutely nothing decayed. Once a worm came out of his ear, and his wife began to worry, what is going to be now? And he came to her in a dream and said, no, it's nothing. It's going to stop at that. It's only because they once heard the Bazayin of a Talmud Chacham and I was not Meicha. So why is this a Maila that the bodies of Tzaddikim remain whole? Isn't that an equal? Doesn't that prevent them from attaining their highest place in Olam Haba? The Bira Inyan, as the Svarim explain, is as follows. The reason that the neshama doesn't attain perfect happiness until the body is decayed is because if there is a mashul of chait on the guf, so kol man the guf is still in existence, the neshama has to deal with that. The neshama has to be cleansed of that. That doesn't mean the neshama is in Gehenna, but there is some equal, there is some prevention over there of the neshama reaching its loftiest place in Gan Eden. The full joy of the chuppah and the canopy that is prepared for tzaddikim, that is prepared for every person after his tikkun. However, a tzaddik whose guf has no mashu of chait, a tzaddik who lived a life and broke his guf, in other words, he broke every temptation, every natural craving of his guf, so the tumah that goes along with the guf is simply not there. The fact that the neshama is still associated with the guf in no way prevents the neshama from feeling the ultimate simcha, pure joy, which of course does not exist on this world. There is no pure joy in this world without any strings attached or some reservations. Even li'acha nevi as neshama takes time till the neshama is zeicha to that. However, the tzaddik can be zeicha to it right away because the existence of his guf is not a problem. It doesn't represent chait. It doesn't represent taiva. He destroyed that when his guf was alive. When Moshe Rabbeinu passed away, the pasuk says, "Vayifku b'nei Yisrael es Moshe b'Yavris Moav Shloshim Yom." Rashi points out that by Aaron HaKohen, there is a stronger lashon. Over there it says, "Vayifku kol beis Yisrael." Why? But Rashi, because Aaron HaKohen was roid of shalom and nice and shalom, ben ish l'reyehu, he always made peace between one person and another, and between wife and husband. Therefore, everyone cried. The women, the men that got back their shalom bayis, the machloikis that had destroyed families, which Aaron HaKohen was able to put together, charim and akavas, everyone cried. But by Moshe Rabbeinu, not everyone was there to appreciate the loss. So you don't have the lashon of kol beis Yisrael. Shua Leib Diskin, the Brisker Rav, asked the kasha. He says, it's shver zach to say over here, when we come to the end of the Torah, and the Torah is now heaping the ultimate praise on Moshe Rabbeinu and leaving us with these words, the shvach of Moshe Rabbeinu. Should we say over here that in these last psukim in the Torah is also indicating, also sending us a message that you should know, not as many people cried by the Levai of Moshe Rabbeinu as they did by Aaron HaKohen? Isn't this to some degree a pchisas hakavod, a pagam in the kavod of Moshe Rabbeinu? The Maril Diskin said a murdik of art. He says, this is not a pagam in the kavod of Moshe Rabbeinu. This is one of the milas of Moshe Rabbeinu. Aaron HaKohen was the most popular person in the world for Klal Yisrael. He was roid of shalom, the oy of shalom. Aaron HaKohen met everyone. He made them feel like they were his best friend. They were chashuv. They were important. He gave them a new lease on life just by looking at them. He was mekarev sabriyas. The whole stature of Aaron HaKohen, his whole environment was Molei Ahava. That's why Aaron HaKohen generated the Anani HaKaveh that surrounded Klal Yisrael and created the environment of love and protection and security. There was not one person that had anything against Aaron HaKohen. Aaron HaKohen could afford to do that because he was the Kohen Gadol. He was not the Rav. Moshe Rabbeinu was the Rebbe of Klal Yisrael. He had to paskin shaylas. He had to be machriya and a machloikis. He had to deal with dinei Torah, where sometimes the answer is clear, you're right and you're wrong. When you're in that position, says the Maril Diskin, It is impossible to satisfy everybody. If you are forceful and honest, then it's inevitably there has to be someone who's going to be displeased. You have those who don't have the courage to stand up for what is right because they are concerned with their public opinion, with their public relations. And as a result, things go unchecked. As a result, certain things that the Rav has to be Misaki never get fixed because you don't want to step on toes. But that's not a Maila. That's a Chasar. Dr. Maril Diskin, this is what the Torah is telling us. Yifku b'nei Yisrael es Moshe. You're right. The Aaron HaKohen, it says, Kol Beis Yisrael. Not to take anything away from Aaron HaKohen. Aaron HaKohen was the epitome of love and ahava and chizuk. But Moshe Rabbeinu had a different job. Moshe Rabbeinu had the job of teaching Klal Yisrael. And the teacher has to engage in both small daicha v'yamin mekareves. The Rav who paskins has to sometimes tell someone he's wrong. And as a result, by Moshe Rabbeinu was Taka v'yifku b'nei Yisrael, it wasn't Kol Beis Yisrael. But that was the mile of Moshe Rabbeinu, not a Hasarin in Moshe Rabbeinu. Incidentally, there's a very interesting Even Ezra. The Even Ezra says that the reason more people cried by Aaron HaKohen was because Moshe Rabbeinu was still alive. So, as a kavod for Moshe Rabbeinu, more people openly showed Avelus that they were mishtatesh with the tsar of Moshe Rabbeinu who lost his brother. So on the one hand, there's a tremendous lesson over here. It shows the importance that if someone is b'tzar, that you are mishtatesh b'tzar, and you even externally show that person that you also feel his pain. On the other hand, the Archaim HaKadosh vehemently argues on this Even Ezra. The Archaim HaKadosh says that, according to the Even Ezra, you're saying that the crying, the hesped, the tsar that Klal Yisrael expressed for Aaron HaKohen wasn't genuine? That it was an external expression, it was a show in order to appease Moshe Rabbeinu? Although that could be admirable in a certain sense when you put it into the right perspective, but despite that, the Archaim HaKadosh says you're still robbing from Klal Yisrael their real feeling of tsar that they had for Aaron HaKohen. And that's the message the Pasuk wants to impress upon us. And therefore he disagrees with this pshat. No. The Kol Beis Yisrael didn't cry any extra because Moshe Rabbeinu was there. Why then did they cry more for Aaron than for Moshe, besides for the Pasuk Shabbat? Rashi tells us because Aaron was the Oyev Shalom v'Rayda Shalom. Even the women felt the loss. So the Archaim HaKadosh, first of all, Aaron HaKohen was nifta suddenly. The Yidden weren't expecting it, and that generates the tears more. Moshe Rabbeinu, on the other hand, had warned Klal Yisrael. He said goodbye to everybody. He gave them his final words. He gave them Musar. So they were ready for it. So the crying didn't come that strong. You also have to realize, said the Archaim HaKadosh, that as soon as Aaron HaKohen was nifter, Klal Yisrael lost the Anani HaKavod. They were vulnerable. The Kanani already came to threaten them. They felt the loss of Aaron HaKohen instantly. Even though the Anani HaKavod also departed with the passing of Moshe Rabbeinu, because Moshe Rabbeinu was inspired to bring back the Anani HaKavod, but that only lasted as long as he was alive. But at this point already, Klal Yisrael was excited about entering Eretz Yisrael, and Yeshua was already there. They were appointed Manig, and he had all of the messages and the Torah of Moshe Rabbeinu. He had the instructions of Moshe. So Mamela, there was the excitement of going into Eretz Yisrael. They didn't feel that vulnerable. They were no longer alone in a midbar. But the third thing the Archaim HaKadosh says is that Yeshua was there to take over. And even though Elazar was also there to take over Aaron HaKohen, but apparently Elazar had his own greatness. He was the new Kohen Gadol. But the people saw in that a replacement of the Kohen Gadol. They didn't see in that a replacement of Aaron HaKohen per se. So there's Mashas in the Archaim HaKadosh. Not Chas V'Shalom, this is the Begam and the Kedusha of Elazar HaKohen, but he had an independent holiness. They didn't see within him that he was an extension of his father, but he was a new tzaddik. On the other hand, Yeshua always based himself, always viewed himself, not as an independent force, but as an extension of Moshe Rabbeinu. He was the Talmud of Moshe that always schlepped the benches and set up the shir and listened to every word that he said. And he had the instructions and the smicha of Moshe Rabbeinu to go on. So to a certain degree, they didn't feel the loss of Moshe that much because Moshe sort of stayed on through his Talmud. And the Anasif, to a certain degree, Moshe Rabbeinu never really left us. The Pasuk says, "V'leikam navi oid bi Yisrael ki Moshe." What does bi Yisrael mean? It should say, Dr. Ben Moshe from the Yerush Rebbe Zechem Habracha. The Zohar HaKadosh says the Ispashtusei of Moshe Rabbeinu is in every single generation. In every nefesh of Klal Yisrael, in the Gedolim of Klal Yisrael, there is a spark of Moshe Rabbeinu. Chai Yisrael understood this. And that's the Lashon of Lekam Navi Oid Bi Yisrael. There will never be another Navi that is Bi Yisrael, that remains in the midst of Klal Yisrael other than Moshe Rabbeinu. Lekam Navi Oid. There will never be another Navi whose Nevius is Nitzchias, an eternal Navi. Agav Rav Shamsham Astrapala says, all the other Nevi'im, when they had a Nevuah, they fell. They wrote Tacha, they fell down. Moshe Rabbeinu was the only one that was able to stand. So that's Shat V'Loikam Navi Oid Bi Yisrael. There was no one that was able to stand like Moshe Rabbeinu. The Ber Moshe points out, really it should say Loikam V'Loyukim. There has never arisen, and there will never stand up a Navi like Moshe Rabbeinu. So one shot is the Torah talks to Lashon Tzara, that's what the pasuk means. But in a deeper sense, he says the Torah is Nitzchias. The Torah is not read to us as a history book. The Torah is read to us as a message today from HaKadosh Baruch Hu to us. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu is telling every single year until Mashiach comes, when you read this pasuk, no Navi has yet stood up like Moshe Rabbeinu. And that is equivalent to saying it'll never be. For Moshe Rabbeinu's Nevuah goes on, and each year that we are Zoicha to be Messiah in the Torah, then there is a new Ispashtusa de Moshe, a new Kiddush of Moshe Rabbeinu, that simply raises us to a higher level and gives us a better understanding or a better opportunity to understand Bereshis Bara Elokim and further. We know that there are different natures of people. There are those who, when they have to take care of something, do it at the first possible moment that it's possible to do. They want it done, they want it off their mind. And then you have those who procrastinate. They'll do it. I'm going to do it, don't worry. I am going to do it. And then you have those that'll never do anything unless they get a phone call and they're told either in the next 10 minutes or the deadline is over, or we'll never have the chance again. That's the only way they do things. Some people build their sukkah right after Tisha B'Av, and some people build it out of the sukkah. The pasuk says, "The Zois habracha sheberach Moshe ishu elikim es bnei Yisrael lifnei Moshe." Lifnei Moshe. Why now? Such Rashi, because he couldn't wait any longer. He knew it was lifnei Moshe, then lo yachshav emusai. So he had to bench them. But it sounds like, without properly understanding this, that is, it sounds like Moshe Rabbeinu waited until the last moment. And when there was no choice, it was listening Moshe, he benched them. Why couldn't Moshe Rabbeinu bench them before? Why did he have to wait until in Layachshav Emasai? Sefer Shem Yishmol says a Meradik art. A bracha is only as good as the makabel. A blessing, sometimes, really depends on the ability of the person to be able to receive the blessing. I can have the most expensive wine in the world, the sweetest wine in the world, but it's hard to me to give it to someone unless he has a glass. The bigger the glass, the more I can give him. The cleaner the glass, the better the wine is going to taste. The nicer the glass, the greater the impression the wine is going to make. Moshe Rabbeinu was willing to bench Klal Yisrael from day one. But Moshe Rabbeinu knew that each day that Klal Yisrael was with him, and each day that they learn Torah, they become better and better. And as a result, Moshe Rabbeinu waited for the last possible moment because he wanted the makabel, the people who receive the bracha, to be in the capacity of receiving the maximum amount of blessing. And if Moshe could have waited longer, he would have waited even longer. Klal Yisrael, particularly during those last moments, were growing higher and higher in their madrega. They acquired a certain relationship with Moshe Rabbeinu that they didn't have until then. It took 40 years to cultivate. It took 40 years of purifying themselves by eating man and drinking the Bashal Miriam and by being surrounded with the Anani Akavi to reach that madrega, to reach that level of being able to be makabel and understanding Moshe Rabbeinu. Had Moshe Rabbeinu been given more time, he would have waited even longer, because the keli to receive it would have been an even better keli. But he couldn't wait any longer. He knew this was all the time that he was given. The brachas of Moshe Rabbeinu, explains the Shem Yishmol, are nitzchias. They go on forever and ever. It's b'shtusa de Moshe b'chol dar v'dar. Moshe Rabbeinu was shown every single generation until Mashiach comes. In all the tzaddikim of the generation, there is a spark of Moshe Rabbeinu, the Zohar HaKadosh says. This idea
that Moshe Rabbeinu waits until the last possible moment so we get the maximum of the bracha also repeats itself every single year. The way we go through the Chamisha Chumshei Torah, the way we live with the Chumash the entire year, from Bereshis to the Zayis HaBracha, that determines our capacity to be able to receive the bracha that is instilled with us every single year when we read the Zayis HaBracha. And the Shem Shmuel says that this really answers a kasha which always bothers me. Why do we make the Siyum of Chumash after Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur? Wouldn't it have been appropriate that we should finish the Zayis HaBracha on Erev Rosh Hashanah, or the last Shabbos of the year? So every single year we finish Chumash. Then as soon as the new year begins, the first Shabbos after Rosh Hashanah, we should start reading Bereshis. But yet no. Chazal instituted the cycle of Chumash so that B'davka, the Siyum of Chumash, extends itself into the new year, and we only start Bereshis after Sukkot. The answer is, says the Sefer Shem Shmuel, because we're different people then. After Rosh Hashanah and after Yom Kippur, after we have purified ourselves, after we have done tshuva, after we've gone through the phase of tshuva me'yira, and we've gone into Sukkot, the phase of tshuva me'ahava, and we're zeicha to sit in the shadow of the Shechina, in the Sukkah, which is compared to a chuppah between Knesset Yisrael and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. After we have reached this madrega of purifying ourselves to the best of our ability, now we want to take in the bracha. The Zayis HaBracha Sheberach Moshe read to us on Simchas Torah finds a nicer and bigger keli to be poured into than it would had it been read to us at Rosh Hashanah. Along these same lines, the Schwab in the Sefer Me'en Beis HaSha'eva points out a fascinating thing. The Ramon Arachaim Siman Tafresh Samachtes Paskins that on Simchas Torah we make a Suda. Why? Because you were zeicha to finish the Torah. What is the makar for this? Well, we know that when Shlomo HaMelech was only 12 years old, Hashem appeared to him in a dream, and the Rebbeinu Shem said to him, ask. You have a wish, ask for what you want. And what did Shlomo HaMelech ask for? To his credit, he asked for wisdom. He asked for chachma, leiv shemeya, for a heart that understands, an ability to be able to judge his people and to listen to his people, and to have the wisdom and the insight that it takes to guide them properly. So Shlomo HaMelech was given to a certain degree the ultimate of the Shari Chachma. All the gates of wisdom were opened up for him, and what did Shlomo HaMelech do as a result of this? Vayal oilos, vayas shlamim, vayas mishta l'chol avadav. He made this great party, this tremendous suda. Amr Rav Elazar, says the Medrash in Shir HaShirim, mikam she'oisen suda l'gam l'shal Torah. So from Shlomo HaMelech we learned that when a person acquires knowledge and wisdom, he should make a suda. But the chayv is schwer. There seems to be a difficulty here, asks Rav Schwab Zechan Levracha. Shlomo didn't finish the Torah. He didn't sit and ponder over the words of Torah. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave it to him as a gift. So maybe, if HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives us the Torah as a gift, and we wake up one morning and suddenly that's it, the whole Torah is on our lips, we open up Sefer after Sefer and we can quote it back and forth. If you wake up one morning and suddenly you realize you know Ho Shas Bar Peh and Ho Shulchan Aruch Bar Peh and the Pri Megadim and all the Paiskim and all the Mefarshim, that's the reason to make a Suda. But the fact that we struggle our way through the Torah with our limited understanding, maybe that's not a reason for a Suda. How can Shlomo HaMelech Suda, when he was given this gift in his dream, how can that be a raya for us making a Suda on Simchas Torah, or in general, the whole concept of a Suda Vayisiyim is derived from here? Well, what's the connection? So the Shalom explains, if you understand the purpose of a siyum, or what the simcha of a siyum is, then you'll see the connection very clearly. When we finish a Masechta and we say Hajanalach, so what we're asking is an opportunity to relearn the Masechta again. And after you've learned a Masechta from cover to cover, and then you start learning it again, then you're zeicha to totally different insights. You understand things from a whole different perspective, from a complete perspective, from an overall perspective. You can't compare the second time you learn something to the first time you learn something. Now you can start being mechadish chidushim. You can understand what Tosfos' kasha really is, what the Rashba's teretz really is. You understand what these Mefarshim have to work things out so that the first mission in the Masechta is consistent with every line of the entire Masechta. Imagine if Schwab explains learning Masechta's Yevamos from cover to cover and then beginning the first Mishnah. It's a different world. If you've never learned Masechta's Yevamos before and you begin the first Mishnah, you may understand some of the isolated ideas line by line, but you don't have a clear picture of what's really happening, of why the Rishonim explain things in certain ways, of what the really Seidos are. And the same is true for every Masechta. I know some very chashuv Megiddo shiurim that have been giving shiurim for decades. And every summer, even though they know they're only going to cover 10, 15, 20 blocks over the course of the year, depending on where they are giving their shiur, they spend the summer beforehand learning that particular Masechta from cover to cover. It opens up a whole different insight. The way you explain things is different if you're familiar with the whole Masechta. So the point of a siyum is not, shoo, I finished. The point of a siyum is, Baruch Hashem, now I can begin to learn and understand. The Samdrov had a son-in-law, Rav Matcha Daiv Stipler. He was an Ish Kaddish Ad Miyad. He was the Stipler Sandik. Stipler always used to stand up Molek Hamasei if an Einikol of Matcha Daiv Stipler came in. He said it was his Sandik who gave him the bracha by his bris that the svarim of this baby are going to lighten up the world. Matcha Daiv was a young boy, maybe 9 or 10 years old. He was a yasim from his mother, Rachmana litzlan. And it was 2 days before Sukkot. It was also 2 days before his mother's yahrzeit. And he had a private melamed that went with him. And he told the Rebbe that he wants to take off 2 days to finish Masechta Sukkah. He wants to make a siyum. So the Rebbe asked him, when are you going to start? He says, he's starting now. So the Rebbe laughed. You want 2 days before Yom Tov off. Okay, take 2 days off. I'm sure you have things to take care of. He didn't think he was serious about learning the entire Masechta in 2 days. But the child came back after 2 days. He said, yes, I'm making a siyum now, Masechta Sukkah. The Rebbe was very angry at him. He said, you're fooling yourself. It's not called learning. A 10-year-old boy can't possibly learn the entire Masechta Sukkah in 2 days. That's called saying kill him. It's not called learning. The little boy, undaunted, challenged his Rebbe and said, test me. So the Rebbe said to him, perhaps even in jest, how many times is the name of Rava mentioned in Masechta Sukkah? The little boy sat down for a couple of moments, thought it over, and he gave the Rebbe a very precise answer. A correct answer. This Melamed refused to learn with this child afterwards. He said, I am not roy to teach him. His ability to understand and to comprehend goes far and beyond what I can convey to him. You must find him someone else. What is the great Moses in this story? The amazing child who was able to learn the Masechta in 2 days. And remember how many times Rabbi's name is mentioned? That's one Moses. The other Moses, what a realist this Melamed was. If this child can be Tosfos the entire Masechta in such a short period of time and see it so clearly, how can I fool myself to suggest that I can still teach him? If he can be Tosfos the entire Masechta from beginning to end, so miraculously, when he starts the beginning of the Masechta, now he can be privy to such insights that's far and beyond my ability to be able to convey to him. How true to himself and to the child this Melamed was in admitting this. So many times I've heard some Yidden who struggle through a cycle of Daf Yomi. We went to Shiurim, we slept, we were up, we chazred, we listened. We don't know how much we retained. But then I would hear from different people, you know something? The second time around, I realized I understand it so much more now. Obviously, something in my subconscious mind, at least, is there from the first time. It's only now that we realize it. So I went through Masechtas Bava Basra the first cycle. I listened. I didn't really think that I retained anything, but the second time I learned it, it was so much clearer. And I told him, I want to tell you something. I don't know about you, but I'll tell you the truth. The first time I learned a black Gemara, all I see is meaningless words. The second time I learn it, I begin to dream about a possible connection between the Kasha and the Teretz. The third time I learn it, I begin to see, in my own superficial way, this is pshat. And the first time I learn it, I feel I'm ready to understand. I'm ready to think I understand it. The joy of the siyum is not I finished. The joy of the siyum is now you're ready to learn. Now you're ready to understand. When Shlomo HaMelech woke up that morning, and he knew right away, this wasn't just a dream, that the Kadosh Baruch Hu really granted him the Leiv Sheinei, and he now had this gift of Chachma. Shlomo had to make a tremendous suda, V'yal Olis V'yas Shlom V'yas Nishta L'chol Avadav. But don't miss the point of the suda. Why did Shlomo make a suda? Because he said, now when I'm going to open up a Masechtas Yavamis, now I'm going to understand what it is from a perspective that I could have never seen till now. Now that Kol HaTorah Kula was gifted to him. The joy of Simchas Torah is not that we got through another year. The joy of Simchas Torah is now when I begin Bereshis, it's going to be a different Bereshis. Because there's one more time that I finished the whole Chumash. So perhaps that is another reason why we don't finish the Zayis HaBracha before Rosh Hashanah, begin Bereshis after Rosh Hashanah, which would appear to be more orderly. Because that would totally mislead us as to what the objective of a siyum is, as to what the joy of Simchas Torah is, as to why the Chassan Torah or Chassan Bereshis gives Kiddush. When the Bakara finishes those words, Li'enei Kol Yisrael, the great joy, the great simcha, the reason for dancing, the reason for singing is now I can begin Bereshis on a much higher level, on a much deeper level, on a much more mature level. And I should already begin to think about the next Zayis HaBracha, next Simchas Torah. Because my ability to relate to those brachas are going to depend on just how well I do from the beginning of Bereshis and on. You know, Chazal ask why the Torah was Koveya Sukkos during the month of Tishrei. After all, if it is a Zechel Yanani Kavod, so it should come along with Pesach. We should have Pesach, and right after Pesach, Sukkos. So we know the many Terutzim. But Chapan in the Sefer Torah HaMelech gives us another insight. At the beginning of Sefer Nehemiah, it says Nehemiah was a Sar HaMashkim for the king of Paras. And then he got terrible news that the matzah of those who were in Yerushalayim was not good. They were suffering terribly. The walls of Yerushalayim were not standing. The enemies of Klal Yisrael were attacking them. And when Nehemiah heard this, he was overwhelmed with grief and sorrow, and he cried. When he came to serve the king noticed his grief on the face. And the king was very upset with him. The king said, Medua Panecha Rayim, you're not sick? Ezakim Raya Leiv. To serve the king with a face like that is tantamount to an evil heart. It's an act of rebellion. And Nehemiah was frightened. He was in a great sakana. So he told the king the truth. And he asked permission to go up to Yerushalayim and to help rebuild the wall. So what do you see from here? What Pamcha Lebracha explained, that sometimes the ultimate act of rebellion is when you serve the king with a foul face. As if to say you're not happy that so-and-so is the king. On Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the Eibishter once again reinstitutes his malchus on the world. And then HaKadosh Baruch Hu draws us into what is really an intimate relationship between Knesset Yisrael and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as explained earlier. The Sukkah, the Tzeilah, the Menusa, the shadow of the Shechina, it's like a chuppah. And what is the greatest thing that the Avdei HaMelech can do for the king? A smile. To show that they're happy that the Malchus of the king has been reinstituted. And that is the kasha between the Yom Neroim and Chag HaSukkot. That's what has to follow each other. And that perhaps is another reason why the siyum of a Zayis HaBracha and its continuity to Bereshis on a higher level has to come dafka after Rosh Hashanah. It has to come during a time of simcha, during a time of joy. Because our ability to understand Torah and to receive the siyata d'shmaya, to really internalize the Torah, depends on how happy we are to have the Torah. The more we show we want it, the more HaKadosh Baruch Hu is willing to give us.
This shiur is distributed by Kol Hadas, 11 Stei Chemet Street, Yerushalayim. For donations, please call 02-5383-999. Fax 02-538-0267. Postbox 57035.